Hello, I'm John Walter, instructor for English 302, Advanced Composition, sections M01 and M03. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about evidence and sources, specifically talking about material from our readings this week from the Craft of Research and the Informed Writer. And I'm going to do so, I'm going to talk about them in the context of how disciplinarity helps shape the questions that we ask and the answers that we provide. In this lecture, we're first going to talk about disciplinary questions, and then we're going to move into talking about understanding the purposes of writing, specifically writing both that we will engage in and writing from the sources that we'll be using. Then talk about sources and evidence, then take a look at some issues of dealing with using sources, and finally some suggestions, some reminders about what to think about when working with sources. So, first, the idea of disciplinarity shaping the questions and answers that we engage with. So, disciplines, we could argue, are defined by the questions they ask and the approaches, methods, and tools they use to answer those questions. The idea here, basically, different disciplines are looking for different things. Last week, I introduced the concept of disciplinarity with a joke about the doctor, the lawyer, and the police officer witnessing a car accident. Just as each responded differently to the phenomena they all witnessed, different disciplines approach topics, even similar topics, differently. As a multidisciplinary field, memory studies actually will work as a really good example of this in action, and which is why we'll be looking at various approaches to the study of memory as we work with Project 1. Some examples of how memory might be studied by a number of different disciplines. So here's some examples of how memory might be studied by a number of different disciplines. For instance, someone in psychology might ask, what are the limits of human memory? While someone in history might ask how historical events are remembered. Someone in neuroscience might ask, what regions of the brain are activated as memories are recalled. And in fact, members of all three of these fields have asked just these questions. Likewise, someone in sociology studying memory may actually approach it in terms of how cultural groups use memory to create social identity. Someone in marketing might look at how effective the use of nostalgia might be in advertising, and someone in biochemistry might study the biochemical processes of synaptic connection formation that leads to basically long-term potentiation, the idea basically sort of how we move the biochemical processes of forming the synaptic connections that lead to storing things in long-term memory. The kinds of questions we ask about memory and how we go about answering those questions are firmly rooted in disciplinarity, and each discipline has its own practices that help shape the questions they ask and the methods they use. For instance, if we think about this here, biochemist is going to be using the techniques of biochemistry. A neuroscientist is probably going to be doing brain scans, while an historian is actually going to be looking at cultural practices. So, and here's one more example of this. I'm going to take a look at actually habit memory. So, while the general questions about the role of habit memory, what we also call procedural memory, might be most common to psychology, it's also a question that might be studied by many other disciplines. For example, someone in education definitely might want to ask, what is the role habit memory plays in learning? Someone engaged in user experience design, it's a branch of technical communication, might ask, what is the role of habit memory in navigating computer interfaces? Someone involved in game studies might want to know what the role habit memory plays in how players navigate first-person shooter games. Someone in composition studies, such as myself, might want to investigate the role habit memory plays in the writing process, and someone in business administration might want to study the role habit memory plays in negotiation and conflict mediation. So shifting topics here, moving on to the idea of understanding purposes. In Chapter 7 of The Informed Writer, we were introduced to this question of a writer's purpose. It's important to note that even academics publishing in scholarly journals often have more than one purpose. The easy thing to say is, well, it's an academic journal, it's a scholar, they're just writing to advance knowledge. Yes, but they probably have other purposes as well. For instance, a game studies scholar studying the role of habit memory and how players navigate first-person shooter games, or an advertising scholar wanting to make better use of nostalgia's role in marketing, are often interested in more than just contributing to the body of knowledge. They're asking such questions because they want to make a better first-person shooter game, or because they want to more effectively sell products. So just as a writer's purpose influences the techniques that a writer will use, a writer's disciplinary approach will influence the reasons why that writer asks certain questions, as well as the approaches, methods, and tools they will use to answer those questions. Basierman offers us a useful catalog of possible writer's purposes on pages 110 and 111. If you haven't looked at it yet, please do. I am assuming that that Basierman's discussion is clear, and as I do with much of the readings. So if you have questions or if you don't understand something that I don't discuss more in depth here in this lecture or other lectures, please ask. Shifting to sources and evidence. In Chapter 5 of The Craft of Research, Booth, Cullum, and Williams introduced three types of sources. Primary sources, basically what they call raw data. It could be interviews, maps, literary texts, experimental data, brain scans, etc. Then we have secondary sources that are research reports that rely upon raw data, generally but not always written by academics, by scholars. Finally, we have tertiary sources, which generally are sort of summaries of secondary sources for general audiences, which may be written by academics, but more often or not, are written by professional writers, journalists, etc., kind of using scholarly sources as their basis to write the book that they're writing, whether it's a textbook, or sort of a book for mass market publication. It's worth noting though that while we have this idea of primary sources, secondary sources, tertiary sources, what's going to count as a primary source or a secondary source will often depend on the writer's purpose and the questions that it's driving the research and one's methods, all of which are influenced by one's discipline. For instance, while scholarly reports are generally considered secondary sources, for an athletic trainer interested in the current trends in concussion assessment and management, scholarly reports can themselves become the raw data, the primary sources of that research project. Likewise, for a biologist interested in how evolution is being taught in high school biology textbooks, summaries of scholarly reports, something we would normally categorize as a tertiary source, may become crucial primary sources for understanding the question of how evolution is being taught in high schools. So, using sources. As Booth, Cullum, and Williams discuss in Chapter 6 of The Craft of Research, we can use secondary sources, scholarly reports, for more than just finding a quote or a fact to support our own argument. In fact, researchers often engage in research well before they know what their argument will be. We can use secondary sources to help us find and define problems that we can turn into a research project, and we can use secondary sources to help us plan our arguments. Now, Chapter 6 of The Craft of Research, again, lists a number of ways, a number of questions and ways that we can actually use secondary sources in these ways. So if you haven't read the chapter, you want to go take a look at Chapter 6 and just skim through that. So, finally, when working with sources, some things you want to keep in mind. Always record your bibliographic information as soon as you think the source might be useful. Just do so. Recording the bibliographic information of more sources than you actually are going to use is much easier to deal with, much less of a problem than if you get some crucial sort of resources, crucial research that you can't find the bibliographic information for later. That can happen. That does happen. So, if you think something's going to be useful, record the information down. Likewise, even if you're working with a hard copy of something, or you have a PDF on, that you're working with on a screen, you've got an annotation program that you can actually annotate the PDF with, take notes, whether they're typed up notes, they're handwritten notes. Actually take notes, because part of the idea of note taking is that you're actually summarizing, you're paraphrasing, you're drawing out quotes. If you just sort of highlight everything or you mark a line down, you then have to go back and look when you're trying to find it, use the source, and you can't sort of separate things out as easily by their topic, which means you have to then kind of skim through the entire article again, the entire book, and just sort of then digest and summarize, put back into context for yourself the passage you've got marked. If you take notes during the process of reading, you will have a much easier time, much more usable research to work with from the get-go. Even if you don't copy a direct quote from a source as you're taking notes, do mark down keywords and phrases with quotation marks. Because if you remember from the readings, from the craft of research and other introductions you've had to issues of summary and paraphrase and quotation, kind of a key term, an unusual phrase, you are going to want to put quotation marks around. So make sure that your notes include the quotation marks around those things that you're going to need to quote. And definitely, if you actually are copying down a direct quote, make sure you put the quotation marks around so you know that you need to actually quote that, treat that word, that phrase, that sentence as a quote when you actually go to write your text. Finally, as Booth, Cullum, and Williams suggest in the chapter 6, when you take down the notes of something, record the context of what they're talking about. As they sort of note, they say, this war was caused by X. Actually, when the source says it was caused by X, Y, and Z, you want to make sure that you actually note, even if you're focused on just topic X, make sure that when you say the war was caused by, X, Y, and Z, and that you're looking at specifically concept X, issue X. So record that context when you're taking your notes. Also record the rhetorical importance of what you're taking notes from. Is it a major claim in the source that you're using? Is it a minor claim? Make note of that. Is it being used to support the larger argument? Is it being used as a refutation to other people who might argue against it? And definitely, don't mistake the author, your source, actually summarizing or paraphrasing someone else and reporting that as what they say. That's a common mistake, usually, sort of for young scholars. So you make sure you understand the rhetorical importance of what the notes you're taking from the passage that you're using from. And finally, you want to make note of the scope and confidence of the claim. If someone's suggesting something as a hypothetical possibility that needs much more research, make note of that. One of the scholars that I work with a lot, Walter Ong, in one of his most widely cited texts, actually the most widely cited chapter in his most widely cited book, he actually starts on the beginning of the chapter. Here's 10 ideas I want to throw out as just hypotheses that we need to do a lot more research on. And then he goes on to the chapter and develops it. One of the most famous refutations of Ong's work actually just says, Ong says these things, and here's a problem with this one, here's a problem with this one, Ong is wrong. Great, except for the fact that Ong never claimed that he was right. He threw out ideas that we needed to work with. That scholar absolutely misrepresented what Ong was arguing, and that has caused problems for that scholar much later on in their career. So take note of the scope and the confidence. If someone is sort of tentatively suggesting something, you can still use it, but note that they're sort of tentatively suggesting it. If they're questioning what someone is saying, make note that they're questioning. If they're saying we have absolute certainty this is true, then make note of that as well. And when you are representing those sources in your text, you can then explain those contexts. You can explain the rhetorical importance, and you can note the scope and confidence of the claim that you're reporting on and using. Okay, as I've said before, if you have questions about anything we've read that I haven't covered here or that I haven't covered in enough depth for you, please ask. I can, again, because I'm sort of recording these cold without and without being able to sort of engage and interact with you all, I don't know what I need to actually cover, and I don't know whether or not my explanations, my sort of highlighting various things is sufficient for you. So please let me know if you need more elaboration on anything. Thank you.